Alva Erskine Smith was born on January 17, 1853, in Mobile, Alabama, and she is remembered today as one of the most forceful women of the Gilded Age, first as Alva Vanderbilt, and later as Alva Belmont. She is usually associated with the Vanderbilt fortune, the rise of Newport society, Marble House, and the later campaign for woman suffrage in the United States. But before she became a Vanderbilt hostess, before she became a public symbol of money, rank, and social authority, she was the daughter of a Southern merchant family whose security was disrupted by war, relocation, and the collapse of the antebellum order. Her life moved from post-war instability to marriage into one of the largest fortunes in America, from exclusion by old New York society to command over it, Zasines, and from family strategy and social architecture to open political activism in the suffrage movement. Before we begin, please comment where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know that this story is being watched from all around the globe. Alva Erskine Smith was born on January 17, 1853 in Mobile, Alabama, into a family that belonged to the commercial elite of the antebellum South. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, was a merchant with transatlantic connections, and her mother, Phoebe Ann Desha, came from a socially established background that tied the family to older Southern networks of standing and influence. The household into which Alva was born understood rank in practical terms. It was visible in domestic management, marriage expectations, social calls, and the careful protection of family reputation. These were not abstract values. They governed how property was held, how alliances were formed, and how women of her class were trained to move through public and private life. The Civil War altered that world at its foundations. Mobile remained a significant Confederate port, but the wider collapse of the Southern economy and the destruction of the slave system changed the meaning of wealth for families like the Smiths. The old assurances of class no longer carried the same security they had before secession and war. This mattered in Alva's case because it exposed her early to the difference between inherited social confidence and actual stability. The family was still cultured and well-connected, but it was living through the unmaking of the environment that had produced its status. That experience would later shape her unusually sharp understanding that prestige had to be defended through visible means and could not be assumed to survive without effort. During her childhood, Alva was also introduced to a wider world beyond Alabama. The Smith family's resources and connections allowed for a style of life that included travel and exposure to European standards of culture. Even before adulthood, she was absorbing the idea that public standing depended on codes of behavior that differed by place but followed recognizable rules. A woman in her position was expected to observe details closely, to understand who mattered in a room, who could confer legitimacy, and what kind of display carried authority. This training was informal, but it was exacting. It came through the example of older relatives, through household order, and through the constant awareness that family identity had to be presented properly. Alva's later reputation for discipline, social aggression, and refusal to accept exclusion did not appear without background. It grew from a childhood shaped by privilege and uncertainty at the same time. She knew what it meant to belong to a world that considered itself superior, and she also saw how quickly material and political change could threaten that belief. This combination helped produce a personality that treated status not as sentiment, but as structure. She learned early that institutions could fail, markets could collapse, and the authority of one generation might not protect the next. The decision to secure position through architecture, marriage, and social organization would come later, but the underlying instinct had already formed. By the time Alva left childhood, the basic pattern of her life had already been established. She had been born into rank, but not into a future guaranteed to preserve it. She inherited Southern memory, commercial discipline, and a strong awareness of hierarchy, yet she was also formed by disruption. That made her unusually prepared for the post-war American world, where fortunes were shifting, new dynasties were rising, and old claims to social supremacy had to be defended in new ways. The circumstances of her birth therefore belong at the beginning of the story for a clear reason. They explain why, when opportunity later appeared in New York, Alva Vanderbilt would approach society not as a spectator, but as a strategist. In the years after the Civil War, the Smith family spent substantial time in Europe, especially in France, and that experience marked Alva more deeply than the usual finishing education available to wealthy American girls. She was no longer being raised only within the social codes of the post-war South. She was now moving through a world in which rank was expressed through architecture, courtly manners, inherited names, and long-established rituals of presentation. Europe did not merely broaden her taste, it gave her a comparative model. She could see the difference between old forms of legitimacy and the more improvisational social ambitions developing in the United States. That distinction would later become central to the way she understood wealth, display, and acceptance. Yet Parisian and continental life offered a form of instruction unavailable in ordinary classrooms. Alva encountered museums, formal interiors, ceremonial hospitality, and the disciplined use of space that old aristocratic societies had refined over centuries. The lessons were practical. A great house was not simply shelter. It could be a tool of social command. A reception was not merely entertainment. It could define rank, exclude rivals, and stabilize alliances. Even decorative taste had institutional meaning when linked to powerful families and public visibility. For a young woman who had already seen one social order collapse in the South, Europe demonstrated that hierarchy could survive upheaval if it was sustained by institutions, symbols, and disciplined performance. At the same time, the Smiths were not themselves European aristocrats. Their position remained that of affluent Americans with cultural access, but without hereditary title. This mattered because Alva was observing old status from the outside, while belonging to a family that had to reestablish itself after war. The result was not imitation alone. It was adaptation. She developed a strong appreciation for French models of elegance and grandeur, but she also understood that in America, such forms had to be built deliberately with money, architecture, and strategic alliances. They would not descend naturally from centuries of recognized lineage. This distinction helps explain why, in later years, Alva would invest so heavily in houses, ceremonials, and marriages capable of manufacturing the visible signs of permanence. Her return to the United States, therefore, did not mean a return to provincial expectations. She came back better prepared than many of her contemporaries to read social competition as a system rather than a matter of personal preference. She had seen how old elites preserved their authority and how public culture reinforced private hierarchy. In the American context of the late 19th century, where new industrial fortunes were rising rapidly, such knowledge was an asset. Men might accumulate railroads, banks, and shipping lines, but women like Alva often managed the symbolic front of dynastic power. She did not invent that role, but her years abroad made her unusually capable of exercising it with precision. By the time she re-entered elite American society, Alva had acquired more than refinement. She had acquired method. Europe had shown her that legitimacy could be arranged through design, ritual, and repetition, and that social authority depended on control of visible forms. These lessons would become essential once she entered the Vanderbilt world. Her later campaigns in New York and Newport were not improvised responses to slight or exclusion. They were grounded in a clear understanding that social structures could be studied, challenged, and redesigned. The years abroad therefore belong not to a decorative prelude, but to the formation of the tools she would later use with extraordinary force. On April 20th, 1875, Alva Erskine Smith married William Kissam Vanderbilt in New York, entering one of the wealthiest families in the United States at a moment when the Vanderbilt fortune was still being consolidated into social power. William K. Vanderbilt was a grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose empire in shipping and railroads had already transformed the family into a national force. Yet the difference between money and social legitimacy remained substantial in New York. The older families that dominated elite society still viewed enormous new fortunes with suspicion. This was the environment into which Alva married. She was not joining a settled aristocracy. She was entering a dynasty rich enough to challenge old New York, but not yet secure enough to govern it. The marriage gave her material power on an extraordinary scale. It also placed her inside a family where inheritance, rivalry, and visibility mattered intensely. The Vanderbilt name carried national weight, but different branches of the family occupied different positions in public life, and the distribution of wealth did not automatically settle the question of prestige. Alva understood this early. She also understood that a wife in such a family could do more than preside over domestic comfort. She could help define the social identity of her branch through residence, hospitality, marriage strategy, and public display. These were not secondary matters in the Gilded Age. They were part of the machinery through which financial empires were converted into durable class authority. Soon after the marriage, Alva became immersed in the expectations of a great American household. This meant managing servants, maintaining formal obligations, organizing travel, and overseeing the presentation of a family whose private life was inseparable from public reputation. Children followed, including Consuelo Vanderbilt and her brothers, and their upbringing immediately carried dynastic implications. In the social world Alva inhabited, sons and daughters were not only loved or disciplined, they were positioned. Education, manners, travel, introductions, and future marriages all had consequences for the standing of the family. Alva did not invent this logic, but she embraced it fully and applied it with greater intensity than many women of her class. The decision to marry William K. Vanderbilt therefore created both opportunity and tension. It offered Alva access to a fortune large enough to reshape elite life, but it also exposed the limits of that fortune in the face of older social gatekeepers. The Vanderbilts possessed railroads, capital, and national prominence, yet were still required to seek recognition from circles that claimed superior breeding and lineage. For a woman with Alva's background and temperament, this was unacceptable as a permanent arrangement. She had not married into wealth in order to remain socially subordinate to families with smaller resources and stronger old names. The contradiction was obvious, and she responded to it as a problem to be solved. The marriage thus stands at the start of Alva's real public career. It gave her the money, institutional setting, and family platform from which her later campaigns would emerge. It also clarified the stakes. She was now operating within the highest level of American wealth, but in a society still uncertain about how new money should be ranked. That uncertainty created the space in which Alva Vanderbilt would act. Her task, as she came to understand it, was not merely to enjoy the Vanderbilt fortune, it was to discipline it into a form that could not be denied. In the years after her marriage, Alva Vanderbilt's life became more deeply rooted in family management, but motherhood did not soften her ambition or reduce her interest in social power. Instead, it intensified her awareness that household life and public standing were inseparable. Her children, especially her daughter Consuelo, would eventually become part of a larger family strategy, and the shape of the Vanderbilt domestic world mattered because it reflected the rank the family hoped to claim. At the same time, Alva encountered the continuing resistance of old New York society, where Caroline Schermerhorn Astor and her circle still exercised outsized authority over formal acceptance. The exclusion was not total, but it was unmistakable. Wealth alone had not resolved the question. Alva treated this situation as structural rather than personal. She understood that elite society in New York functioned through coded practices that women largely administered: calls, invitations, dinner tables, reception rooms, and public acknowledgments were not trivial forms. They were procedures by which legitimacy was granted or withheld. The Vanderbilts had the money to dominate this world, yet were still being measured against inherited standards that privileged older names. Alva concluded that waiting patiently for approval would only confirm subordination. The decision to challenge the system grew directly from this assessment. She would not argue for admission in abstract terms. She would force recognition by making refusal increasingly impractical inside the household, and this meant a greater emphasis on management and presentation. Staff, routines, furnishings, travel, and hospitality all became instruments in a campaign that extended beyond the family itself. Alva's children were being raised in an atmosphere where manners and position were observed closely and where their mother's will shaped the domestic order. The intensity for which she later became famous was already visible. She expected discipline, seriousness, and attention to detail. These expectations were not only temperamental, they reflected a broader understanding that a family seeking to govern elite society could not appear disordered in its own private arrangements. Household authority and public authority reinforced one another. This period also sharpened Alva's sense of the power available to women operating within conventional limits. Men controlled railroads, mech banks, and corporate boards, but women of her class often controlled the settings in which social power was displayed and interpreted. A woman who managed houses and ceremonies on a grand scale could shape the public meaning of wealth itself. Alva grasped this with unusual clarity. She did not need office or title to exercise authority. She needed spaces, resources, and the determination to use them without apology. By the early years of her marriage, she had already begun to think in these terms. The conflict with old New York simply gave that thinking sharper purpose. The result was a decisive shift in Alva's role. She was no longer merely a Vanderbilt wife overseeing a prosperous family. How she was becoming the architect of a social campaign that aimed to reverse the hierarchy of elite New York. Motherhood remained central to her life, but it existed within a larger project of dynastic ascent. The resistance she encountered from older social leaders did not weaken her position. It clarified her objective. The next phase of her career would show how deliberately she intended to pursue it. Alva Vanderbilt's response to social resistance took visible form in the great house she developed with William K. Vanderbilt on Fifth Avenue, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, and completed in the early 1880s. Often called the Petit Chateau, the residence was conceived as far more than a domestic address. It was an assertion that the Vanderbilt branch, headed by Alva and William, intended to challenge old New York on the terrain it understood best: architecture, ceremonial scale, and cultivated display. Hunt's design drew on French precedent, and that choice reflected Alva's own European education. She recognized that a house could function not merely as property, but as argument. If accepted society valued cultural sophistication, then the Vanderbilt response would be to embody that sophistication on a scale impossible to ignore. The project demanded enormous expense, but cost alone was not the point. The interiors, imported materials, furnishings, and formal organization of rooms all mattered because they created a setting in which rank could be staged. Great houses in the Gilded Age served as platforms for a specific kind of political work. They controlled circulation, visibility, and social encounter. They determined who could be received, under what conditions, and in what symbolic environment. Alva involved herself deeply in this process. She did not leave the house to architects and decorators acting without direction. The residence bore her preferences, her understanding of European models, and her belief that status had to be materialized in stone, marble, and ritualized hospitality. The decision created new consequences. Once the house stood on Fifth Avenue, the Vanderbilt branch led by Alva could no longer be treated as merely affluent outsiders waiting politely for recognition. The building announced that they possessed the means and discipline to establish standards of their own. In effect, the house challenged older families to decide whether they would continue to exclude those who were already redefining the scale and vocabulary of elite urban life. This was one of Alva's recurring strengths. She forced others to react to facts she had created rather than to claims she had merely asserted. The Fifth Avenue mansion was such a fact. It altered the social landscape simply by existing in the form it did. The house also revealed Alva's larger method. She understood that architecture could stabilize a family's public identity across time. A great residence attached the name of its owners to a location, a style, and a set of expectations. It gave the family a permanent stage on which to gather allies, impress rivals, and direct the rituals of high society. For a dynasty whose wealth derived from recent industrial expansion, this was especially important. Houses could suggest continuity where rapid accumulation of money alone could not. The Fifth Avenue residence therefore helped transform the Vanderbilts from possessors of a fortune into claimants of a cultural position. By the time the house opened, the terms of the contest in New York had shifted. Then Alva Vanderbilt had turned domestic architecture into a strategic weapon, and in doing so showed that she understood elite society as a system that could be manipulated through space as well as through money. The mansion did not settle every question, but it made the next move possible. Once the stage had been built, it could be used. The famous ball that followed would demonstrate exactly how effectively Alva intended to use it. The decisive public test of Alva Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue strategy came with the celebrated costume ball she staged in the early 1880s, an event that quickly entered the record of Gilded Age society as one of its defining spectacles. The ball was remembered for its scale, luxury, and carefully controlled guest list, but its deeper significance lay in the social pressure it created. Caroline Astor and the circle associated with her had continued to represent the old authority of New York society. Alva understood that symbolic recognition from that world still mattered. Rather than ask for it directly, she structured an event so important that exclusion became difficult to maintain. The mechanism was social, but the result was political. The invitation list was central to the strategy. In the elite culture of the period, invitations signaled rank as clearly as titles or property. To be included in a major event confirmed standing. To be omitted could expose weakness. Alva used this system with precision. By making attendance desirable and by controlling access, she placed the older social leadership in a position where refusal risked irrelevance. The most famous element in the story was the pressure surrounding Mrs. Astor and her daughter, whose participation helped convert the event from a Vanderbilt triumph into a larger realignment. Whether each detail later repeated in social memory was shaped by embellishment or not, the outcome is clear. The barrier that had limited Alva's formal acceptance no longer held in the same way after the ball. The event also showed how effectively Alva combined architecture and ceremony. The Fifth Avenue house provided the setting, but the ball transformed that setting into an instrument of public persuasion. Costumes, decorations, household staff, music, and the ordered movement of guests all contributed to a display that conveyed not merely spending power but administrative mastery. This was important because social authority in the Gilded Age did not rest only on extravagance. It also depended on one's ability to impose form on extravagance and turn abundance into visible order. Alva excelled at that. The ball suggested that she was not simply rich. She was capable of directing a social world large enough to absorb the old elite rather than submit to it. The consequences extended beyond her personal victory. Competitive display among the wealthy intensified as great fortunes sought similar forms of recognition. The Gilded Age did not invent conspicuous hospitality with Alva's ball, but her success helped normalize a higher scale of ceremonial rivalry in both New York and Newport. The event thus belongs to a broader transformation in American upper-class culture, where houses became larger, entertainments more elaborate, and the social role of wealthy women more openly strategic. Alva had not merely joined that development, she had accelerated it by demonstrating how social exclusion could be defeated through concentrated spectacle. After the ball, Alva Vanderbilt no longer occupied an uncertain place at the edges of elite life. She had helped redefine who possessed authority within it. This did not end conflict, and it did not make her universally admired, but it established a pattern that would continue through the rest of her social career. She identified a structure that limited her, studied the rules by which it operated, and used wealth, architecture, and disciplined ceremonial planning to force a new arrangement. The success of the ball made clear that her campaign had moved from ambition to command. The death of William Henry Vanderbilt in the middle of the 1880s transformed the financial structure of the family and expanded the resources available to William K. Vanderbilt and, by extension, to Alva's ambitions. William H. Vanderbilt had presided over one of the greatest fortunes in the United States, and the transfer of wealth to the next generation gave individual branches of the family a broader scope for independent action. For Alva, this change mattered because it increased the means with which she could shape social standing through residences, collections, hospitality, and dynastic planning. The family had already secured significant visibility. The inheritance now allowed her to pursue scale on a level that few households in America could rival. Money in this period was not simply a matter of private comfort. It determined the number of houses a family could maintain, the extent of travel, the size of domestic staffs, the cost of art acquisitions, and the nature of entertainments that could be staged regularly rather than exceptionally. Alva approached these possibilities with a practical sense of their social value. The Vanderbilt branch she represented did not need to prove that it was rich. That had already been settled. The question now was how that wealth would be translated into durable symbols of rank. Jewels, yachts, imported furnishings, carriages, and major architectural commissions all contributed to the answer, but only when organized into a coherent public identity. This expansion of resources also increased the significance of Newport, where wealthy Americans spent the summer season and where competition among new and established elites took architectural form. The shift from New York to Newport each year was not a retreat from public life. It was a transfer to another arena in which social ranking continued under seasonal conditions. Alva understood that dominance in one location would be incomplete without equivalent authority in the other. The inheritance therefore supported not only a higher level of spending, but a broader campaign across multiple sites of elite interaction. Fifth Avenue had established the Vanderbilts as unavoidable in New York. The next challenge was to achieve similar prominence in Newport. Inside the family, greater wealth also sharpened questions of management and succession. Children grew within an environment where fortune itself required administration, and the public behavior of heirs had increasing significance. Alva's determination to shape her children's futures must be understood in this context. She was not merely imposing private wishes. She was managing what she believed to be the long-term social destiny of a dynastic branch, now wealthy enough to compete internationally. The link between family decision and public consequence became even stronger as the scale of the fortune increased. That made Alva's authority within the household more consequential than before. The inheritance period therefore marks a shift from breakthrough to consolidation. Alva had already won visible victories in New York. Now she possessed resources sufficient to expand those victories into a broader social program. So the decision to build on a grander scale in Newport followed naturally from this new position. Increased wealth did not alter her method. It magnified it. What had begun as a campaign for recognition was becoming a system of rule. Marble House in Newport emerged from this new phase of enlarged wealth and ambition, and its construction in the late 1880s and early 1890s stands among the clearest expressions of Alva Vanderbilt's social vision. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the house was conceived as a birthday gift from William K. Vanderbilt, yet it bore the unmistakable imprint of Alva's taste, discipline, and strategic priorities. Newport had already become a summer center for the American upper class, but Marble House helped transform it into something more monumental. It signaled that the seasonal life of wealthy families would no longer be conducted in comparatively informal villas alone. It would be staged in palatial residences built to rival European models in scale, material, and ceremonial effect. The house took its name from the extraordinary quantity of marble used in its construction and decoration, and that choice was itself a declaration. Marble House did not merely suggest expense, it suggested permanence, lineage, and a level of cultivated ambition intended to place the Vanderbilts within a transatlantic vocabulary of greatness. Alva's earlier education in Europe had taught her the political meaning of architectural form, and she applied those lessons with force here. Rooms were designed not just for domestic use, but for reception, procession, and display. The house could host the kind of entertainments through which seasonal society in Newport ranked itself, and it could do so in a setting that made comparison with other families unavoidable. The decision changed Newport's architectural culture. As more stone palaces appeared, the town's social geography shifted. Great fortunes began to define themselves through landmark residences that combined aesthetic ambition with social rivalry. Marble House therefore belongs not only to Alva's biography, but to the broader history of the Gilded Age built environment. It accelerated a movement in which private houses performed public work by stabilizing names, demonstrating financial power, and giving wealthy women an enlarged stage on which to exercise authority. Alva was especially suited to this development because she saw clearly that architecture could codify a family's claim to leadership. The house also had a more personal meaning. Alva's close identification with Marble House reflected the degree to which she treated residents as an extension of self and family program. The building embodied her victory over social exclusion and her success in translating money into a recognized aesthetic order. Yet it also served a practical role in the next stage of her life. Within its rooms, family strategy, entertaining, and later even political work would unfold. Marble House was not a static monument. It was infrastructure. It supported the operations through which Alva managed relationships, displayed rank, and eventually redirected social tools toward public activism. By the time Marble House stood complete, Alva Vanderbilt had moved beyond the initial struggle for acceptance. She now controlled one of the signature properties of the American upper class and had helped redefine Newport itself. The consequences were lasting. Her authority rested not only on the Vanderbilt fortune, but on the visible environments through which that fortune had been disciplined into social command. Marble House confirmed that she was no longer contesting the hierarchy from outside. She was helping set its terms. With commanding residences in New York and Newport, Alva Vanderbilt entered a phase in which household management, social power, and family strategy became inseparable. She was no longer focused only on securing admission to elite society. That work had largely succeeded. The question now was how to preserve and extend the position she had won. In families of enormous wealth, this meant treating children, marriages, and public representation as elements of a larger dynastic structure. Alva approached that structure with unusual directness. She supervised the social development of her household carefully, and she expected the behavior of her children to support not simply family harmony, but family advancement. The Gilded Age upper class placed great importance on seasonal movement, public introductions, marriage prospects, and the visible accomplishments of heirs. Sons had to be prepared for responsibility within a world of property, travel, and inherited expectation. Daughters, especially those with beauty, money, and an internationally legible surname, could become central figures in transatlantic alliance making. Alva understood this clearly. Consuelo Vanderbilt, in particular, occupied a position of extraordinary strategic value because she united youth, wealth, public notice, and maternal ambition. The management of her future would eventually become one of the most controversial aspects of Alva's life, But the logic behind that management was already visible by the time the family reached its fullest social power. This was also the period in which Alva's reputation for hardness became more widely established. She was admired for intelligence, elegance, and administrative force, but she could also appear inflexible and exacting. Such qualities were often interpreted differently depending on the observer. In a man, similar traits might have been described as authority or decisiveness. In Alva, they contributed to the enduring image of a woman prepared to subordinate sentiment to system. The distinction matters because it shaped later memory. Her career is often reduced to personality alone, yet many of the actions for which she was judged were rooted in the expectations of elite dynastic management as it existed in her time. Within the household, daily life therefore operated under a regime of expectation tied to public consequence. Travel, introductions, education, dress, and conduct mattered because they contributed to a family image that had been built at high cost. The Alva did not believe that such an image could be left to chance. Her own ascent had required discipline, planning, and constant vigilance, and she applied that same logic to her children. The decision created strain, especially for a daughter like Consuelo, whose personal wishes did not always align with maternal strategy. But from Alva's perspective, private preference could not be allowed to undermine the larger position the family had achieved. This phase of her life is crucial because it shows Alva not simply as a social conqueror, but as a dynastic administrator. She had built the settings, won the recognition, and organized the rituals. Now she was trying to secure continuity through the next generation. The methods that made her formidable in public society were being applied more intensely within the family itself. That shift would define the next and most controversial chapter of her career. By the early 1890s, Alva Vanderbilt had begun to direct increasing attention toward the future marriage of her daughter Consuelo, whose beauty, wealth, and public prominence made her one of the most desirable heiresses in the transatlantic world. At the same time, many titled British families faced growing financial pressure as agricultural decline, debt, and the cost of maintaining great estates strained traditional aristocratic wealth. This conjunction produced a recognizable pattern in late 19th century society. American money moved toward British title, and British title offered a form of historic legitimacy that American industrial fortunes could not easily manufacture for themselves. Alva understood the pattern fully and saw in it an opportunity of the highest order. The prospective match with Charles Spencer Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, therefore carried significance far beyond romance or private preference. Blenheim Palace, the Marlborough title, and the long political history attached to that house represented precisely the kind of hereditary prestige that fascinated wealthy American families seeking international standing. For Alva, the marriage promised to place the Vanderbilt connection inside one of Britain's great ducal lines. This would not erase the family's relatively recent rise, but it would overlay it with a powerful symbol of continuity. Consuelo was central to that strategy. Her fortune made the match financially attractive, while her beauty and public visibility made it socially impressive. The problem, which later accounts have emphasized repeatedly, was that Consuelo herself did not want the marriage. Alva's insistence and the pressure she brought to bear became central to the historical memory of the episode. This is where her reputation for ruthlessness acquired one of its most durable foundations. Yet the event must be understood in context. Elite marriages of the period often carried heavy family involvement, and the exchange of money, title, and social position was not unique to the Vanderbilts. What distinguished the Marlborough case was the intensity with which Alva pursued it and the degree to which later memoir and public memory preserved the conflict. The negotiations surrounding the match reveal Alva at the peak of her dynastic thinking. She was not simply seeking a respectable husband for her daughter. She was trying to secure the Vanderbilt name a place within a centuries-old aristocratic structure that American wealth alone could not replicate. This did not require the abandonment of her American ambitions. On the contrary, it extended them. A ducal alliance would validate the family's social ascent on an international scale. In that sense, the proposed marriage fit perfectly within the logic that had already produced the Fifth Avenue House, the Grand Ball, and Marble House. Each had been a different means of converting money into recognized status. By the time the Marlborough match moved toward conclusion, the costs were already visible. Consuelo's resistance, Alva's determination, and the public attention surrounding the arrangement made the episode more than a family decision. It became a widely legible example of how Gilded Age ambition operated within private life. The marriage would soon be completed, but even before that happened, the structure of the conflict had become clear. Alva was willing to use maternal authority in the service of dynastic design, and that decision would shape how both admirers and critics remembered her. In the middle of the 1890s, Alva Vanderbilt took the unusual step of divorcing William Kissam Vanderbilt, bringing to an end a marriage that had given her wealth, position, and the platform from which she had transformed New York and Newport society. Divorce among the American upper class remained comparatively uncommon and carried reputational risk, particularly for women. Yet by this stage, the marriage had become strained beyond repair, and the formal legal break changed the structure of Alva's power in important ways. She was no longer dependent on authority exercised within her husband's household. Instead, she emerged from the divorce with substantial independent resources, including control of Marble House, and with a public identity strong enough to survive separation. The legal and financial consequences were considerable. Wealthy women in the 19th century often had influence without equivalent autonomy, especially when large fortunes remained tied to male family structures. Alva's settlement altered that balance. She retained not only material means, but also the social reputation she had already built through years of architectural patronage and ceremonial command. This distinction matters because it allowed her to continue functioning at the highest level of elite life, without having to preserve a marriage that no longer served either domestic stability or strategic coherence. The divorce did not remove her from society. It created a new position from which she could act in her own right. The timing was also significant because it coincided with the final movement toward Consuelo's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough. In public memory, the divorce and the ducal match often stand close together as evidence of Alva's willingness to reorganize family life in pursuit of a different future. One marriage ended, another was imposed. The sequence reinforced the impression of a woman directing domestic events with unusual force, yet the divorce should not be read only through the lens of personality. It also reflected the broader instability that could exist within great Gilded Age households, where public magnificence often concealed private dissatisfaction, competing ambitions, and emotional distance. Alva's separation from William K. Vanderbilt also loosened her institutional ties to the internal politics of the wider Vanderbilt clan. She remained connected by children and by the public legacy of her earlier work, but she no longer had to operate through the formal role of Vanderbilt wife. That freedom later proved decisive. The capacities she had developed in social warfare, architectural control, and household administration could now be redirected under her own name. The divorce therefore belongs not simply to a private narrative of marital failure, but to the history of female autonomy among the very rich in the late 19th century. The immediate effect of the divorce was to close one phase of Alva's life and open another. She had used the Vanderbilt marriage to build a social empire, and now she stepped out of it with much of her power intact. The decision shocked some observers and confirmed the strength of her will in the eyes of others. More importantly, it created the conditions under which her later transformation would become possible. Alva had ceased to be merely the formidable Mrs. Vanderbilt. She was becoming an independent force with money, property, experience, and a demonstrated capacity to act without deference. Consuelo Vanderbilt married the Duke of Marlborough in the middle of the 1890s, and the wedding immediately became one of the most famous examples of the transatlantic marriage market that linked American fortunes with British titles. The event was treated in newspapers and society circles as a triumph of scale and symbolism. An American heiress of immense wealth had entered one of Britain's great aristocratic houses, bringing money to a title that still carried political and historical prestige across the English-speaking world. For Alva, the marriage represented the successful completion of a strategy years in the making. It confirmed that the Vanderbilt name could now participate in a form of hereditary distinction unavailable within the American Republic itself. The economic logic of such unions was well understood. And many British aristocratic families possessed ancient estates, but faced declining agricultural income and rising maintenance costs. American industrial wealth, by contrast, was new, liquid, and often enormous. Marriage could bridge the two systems. Yet the Marlborough match became more visible than many similar unions, because Consuelo's name was already prominent and because the tension within the family later entered the public record. Consuelo's reluctance and Alva's pressure gave the marriage a moral and emotional dimension that made it emblematic of a broader age. People could see in unusually concentrated form how class, gender, wealth, and parental authority converged in elite society. For Alva, the result appeared to justify the method. The Vanderbilt family, only recently treated as socially uncertain by parts of old New York, now possessed a direct connection to an ancient ducal line. Blenheim Palace, with its national and family history, stood as a level of old-world legitimacy that American mansions, however splendid, could only imitate symbolically. This explains why the marriage mattered so much to her. It translated social ambition into a hereditary framework. If the Fifth Avenue house and Marble House had turned money into authority in America, the Marlborough alliance turned money into title abroad. In structural terms, it was an extension of the same project. The long-term consequences, however, complicated the apparent success. The marriage did not produce domestic happiness, and later accounts by Consuelo ensured that the coercive side of the story would remain central to Alva's reputation. Historians returning to the episode have therefore had to hold two facts together. The match was undeniably effective as social strategy, and it was also deeply costly at the level of private life. That combination is one reason the event continues to define Alva in public memory. It reveals both her extraordinary clarity of purpose and the limits she was willing to cross in pursuit of dynastic advancement. Once the wedding had taken place, the practical object of Alva's campaign had been secured, but the moral judgment on that campaign remained unsettled. The marriage strengthened the family's standing while intensifying criticism of Alva's methods. It therefore marks both the high point of her social program and the point at which that program appeared most exposed to later reproach. The chapter closes not with social defeat, but with a more complicated form of victory, one that would continue to shape how her life was interpreted long afterward. In the late 1890s, Alva married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, linking herself to another major American family whose influence extended through finance, politics, and elite society. Oliver Belmont was the son of August Belmont, a powerful banker and political figure, and the marriage moved Alva into a new institutional setting without diminishing the public force of the identity she had already built. She became Alva Belmont, but she did not cease to be the same woman who had mastered Fifth Avenue in Newport. The second marriage should therefore be understood as a transition in framework, not a retreat from the authority she had established during her Vanderbilt years. The Belmont connection widened her access to political and social circles that differed in tone from the Vanderbilt environment. August Belmont's name was associated not only with wealth, but with diplomacy, finance, and party politics. Oliver himself belonged to a family whose public life was more explicitly tied to government and political influence than the railroad-rooted Vanderbilt Dynasty. Alva's remarriage thus inserted her into networks that would later matter as her own interests moved toward reform and organized activism. At the same time, her residences, travel, and seasonal life continued to reflect the habits of the topmost American elite. Newport remained important, and Belcourt, associated with the Belmonts, became part of the architectural and social world through which she continued to operate. This period is important partly because it demonstrates that Alva's power did not depend solely on the Vanderbilt name. She had entered that family as an ambitious and disciplined young woman, helped raise its social authority, and then emerged from the marriage, able to carry her own significance into a second union. That was not common. Many women of her class were known primarily through husbands or fathers. Alva had become a figure whose reputation traveled with her because it rested on visible achievements, houses, entertainments, social victories, and dynastic decisions already known on both sides of the Atlantic. The Belmont marriage benefited from that reputation as much as it reshaped it. Her years with Oliver Belmont also helped confirm a pattern in Alva's life. She remained intensely interested in the management of space, ceremony, and public relationships, but the emphasis of her ambition was slowly changing. The social triumphs of the previous decade had already been won, and the obvious avenues for further ascent were narrower than before. She had entered the Vanderbilt Dynasty, secured entry into old society, built Marble House, and arranged a ducal marriage for her daughter. The second marriage placed her in a position of continued prestige, yet it also set the stage for a broader redefinition of purpose once widowhood arrived. The Belmont years therefore occupy a transitional place in the story. They preserved Alva at the center of elite life, while loosening the direct hold of Vanderbilt family politics on her future. She was still operating at the highest level of wealth and visibility, but the next phase of her life would no longer be shaped solely by society. The skills she had developed remained intact. The question was how they would be used once the structure of her personal life shifted again. Even before her turn toward organized politics, Alva had established herself as a woman whose authority was expressed through design, architecture, and the disciplined use of space. This dimension of her career is often overshadowed by the better-known stories of society and marriage strategy, yet it is essential to understanding how she exercised power. In the Gilded Age, wealthy women could rarely command formal institutions in the way men did, but they often influenced the symbolic and social environments in which elite authority was displayed. Alva operated at the most ambitious end of that range. She treated houses as systems, not ornaments. Rooms, circulation, decor, materials, and ceremonial use all had social consequences, and she directed them with unusual precision. Her work with Richard Morris Hunt on the Fifth Avenue residence and Marble House illustrates this clearly. She was not a passive patron simply approving plans drawn by others. She brought strong preferences, clear historical references, and a practical understanding of what these environments were meant to accomplish. The houses associated with her name were designed to organize behavior, impress rivals, and codify family identity. In that sense, architecture served as a form of governance. It arranged the conditions under which people met, dined, observed one another, and understood the status of the host. This was particularly important in a society where ritual and hierarchy remained central, but had to adapt to the explosive growth of industrial fortunes. The same logic applied to interiors and ceremonial use. Alva knew that a great house required more than grand facades. It had to function properly as a place of social administration. The placement of guests, the sequence of rooms, the relation between private and public spaces, and the visual language of materials all contributed to the authority of the household. These were not incidental choices. They shaped the success of events and the memory they left behind. A woman who mastered such matters could wield real influence without holding public office. Alva's reputation for command therefore rested partly on the fact that she could turn domestic settings into disciplined arenas of elite power. This aspect of her life also helps explain the continuity between her society years and her later political activism. The transition from grand hostess to suffrage leader was significant, but it did not involve the abandonment of her earlier methods. It involved their transfer. The organizational habits required to manage major houses, staffs, entertainments, and public symbolism were closely related to the habits needed for fundraising, event planning, and movement infrastructure. Alva's capacity to think in terms of rooms, institutions, audiences, and visible effect did not disappear when her priorities changed. It became newly useful in a different field. By the time this phase closed, Alva had already demonstrated that female authority in her world could be exercised through the built environment with substantial force. She was not merely decorating wealth. She was shaping how wealth entered public life. That achievement belongs to the historical record independently of the marriages and controversies for which she is more often remembered. It also forms the bridge between the first half of her life and the second. The woman who later turned houses into sites of suffrage politics had already learned, through architecture, how space itself could be used to command attention and organize power. The death of Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont in the early 1900s marked the beginning of a major change in Alva's public life. Widowhood left her with substantial wealth, extensive experience in elite administration, and a level of independence that many women of her generation could not attain. She was no longer defined primarily by a living husband's position within a family structure. Instead, she possessed money, property, public reputation, and freedom of action under her own authority. At precisely this point, the reform climate of the progressive era was widening opportunities for women to enter organized campaigns, and the movement for woman suffrage was gaining new strength. These conditions created the setting in which Alva redirected her life. The shift should not be misunderstood as a simple conversion from society to conscience. Alva did not suddenly abandon one world and discover another. Rather, she began to apply capacities developed in the Gilded Age to a political cause that required money, visibility, organization, and persistence. Her interest in suffrage was real and sustained, but it gained force because she was unusually well equipped to support it. She knew how to convene people, how to use houses effectively, how to command press attention, and how to impose order on ambitious undertakings. Widowhood freed those capacities from the obligations of a second marriage and allowed them to flow into reform. Her early political activity connected suffrage to broader concerns about women's status and labor. This was significant because it moved her beyond the limited role of social benefactor. She was not simply donating to respectable causes from a distance. She was entering the machinery of advocacy. That required learning a different set of institutions, including leagues, committees, organizers, and movement leadership. Yet the transition was less abrupt than it might appear. The discipline needed to manage a household like Marble House was not identical to the discipline needed in political work, but it was related. Both depended on planning, visible authority, and the ability to sustain effort over time. This period also altered public perceptions of Alva. To some observers, her suffrage work seemed a remarkable redefinition of purpose for a woman once associated with social conquest and dynastic marriage. To others, there was continuity. The same force of will that had driven her through society now appeared in politics. Both readings contained truth. What changed was the object of her energy, not the energy itself. She remained decisive, exacting, and unwilling to accept subordinate status where she believed structural change was necessary. The movement gave her a field in which those qualities could serve a cause larger than family advancement. By the end of this transition, Alva Belmont had become more than a famous society figure with reform interests. She had entered a new phase of organized public action. Widowhood did not diminish her presence. It created the conditions under which she could become influential in a different register. The social authority of the Gilded Age was now being converted into political leverage, and the next steps would show how deliberately she intended to make that conversion. In the years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Alva Belmont remained involved in the organized political life of women rather than treating the vote as a final endpoint. She continued to support the National Woman's Party and broader campaigns for legal equality, using her wealth to strengthen institutions that outlasted the immediate suffrage battle. By this stage, her public identity had already been transformed. She was still remembered as the commanding Mrs. Vanderbilt of the Gilded Age, but she was also recognized as one of the major benefactors and leaders of militant women's suffrage. The coexistence of these two reputations is central to understanding her place in history. They were different, but they were not unrelated. Her later years were spent between the United States and Europe, reflecting both her long-standing international orientation and the social habits of the class to which she belonged. Yet her historical significance was increasingly anchored in American developments. The institutions she supported in Washington and elsewhere demonstrated that she was thinking beyond a single campaign. Permanent offices, organized leadership, and durable property mattered because they allowed women's political work to continue after formal enfranchisement. This was consistent with the organizational habits visible throughout her life. She valued structures that endured. Whether in the form of houses or political headquarters, she understood that authority required places from which it could be exercised repeatedly. Alva died in Paris in the early 1930s, closing a life that had crossed several different American worlds. She had been born into the antebellum South, shaped by war and displacement, married into one of the country's greatest industrial fortunes, dominated elite society in New York and Newport, and then moved into organized feminist politics during the Progressive Era and after. Few women of her generation occupied such varied historical settings with equal force. That breadth explains why she remains difficult to summarize. Any interpretation that presents her only as a ruthless society mother or only as a suffrage benefactor is incomplete. The record shows both realities, and they must be kept in view together. The divided nature of her reputation is itself historically useful. It reveals how power worked for wealthy women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Alva could be controlling within family life and politically visionary in public life. She could uphold hierarchy in one context and challenge exclusion in another. Those tensions were not accidental. They reflected the transitional character of the era she inhabited, when women of means could move from domestic influence toward organized politics without necessarily abandoning older assumptions about class, authority, and command. Her life, therefore, illuminates more than individual character. It exposes the structures through which female power operated and changed. The final consequence of Alva Belmont's career is that she stands at the intersection of two major histories. One is the history of the Gilded Age elite, with its fortunes, houses, marriages, and symbolic battles for rank. The other is the history of American women's political advancement in the early 20th century. She helped shape both. That is why she remains a consequential figure. The same woman who forced New York society to acknowledge her also helped fund and sustain a movement that forced the state to acknowledge women as voters.